The sky above Bremen was on fire. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent hundreds of bombers deep into northern Germany. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, the beating heart of the Luftwaffe's production line. Among them flew a brand new B-17 Flying Fortress, serial number 423167, call sign Ye Old Pub. It was commanded by Second Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old farm boy from Weston, West Virginia. On his very first combat mission, they reached Bremen in daylight. The flak over the city was so thick, one crewman later said, "You could have walked on it." Black bursts filled the sky. Every explosion sounded like God slamming a door. The fortress took a direct hit before even dropping its bombs. The nose was torn open. One engine coughed black smoke. The oxygen lines hissed, but Brown held course. He wanted the target bombs away. A clean release. And then hell the formation scattered. German fighters swarmed like hawks over wounded prey. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Fw-190s diving out of the clouds. Brown's top turret gunner screamed a heading. The tail gun rattled, then went silent. The pub's armor-plated belly rang with cannon shells. "Number 2's hit," shouted the flight engineer over the static. "Number 3's gone." Brown checked the gauges. Engine 4 flickered red. The controls felt like lead in his hands. He could smell hydraulic fluid and burnt flesh. By the time they cleared the city, half the crew were wounded or dead. The co-pilot, Spencer Luke, slumped over his controls with blood pooling under his seat. The radio operator's arm was hanging by a thread of cloth. Frost crept across the cockpit glass. At 27,000 feet, the air itself was killing them. The rest of the group was already gone. The B-17 was alone. Brown's oxygen mask hissed between breaths. He reached up, pressed his gloved fingers to a cracked section of the canopy. Through it he saw his reflection, young, pale, terrified, and the endless grey sea of cloud beyond. He thought, "This is where it ends." The intercom crackled again. "Skipper," said the waist gunner, his voice trembling, "we've got company at 6 o'clock. Closing fast." Brown turned his head, expecting death. Out of the haze came a shape so clean and sharp it looked carved from the air itself, a Messerschmitt Bf-109G6, yellow spinner gleaming, black cross on the wings. Its guns glinted in the pale winter light. Charlie's hands gripped the yoke. The fortress couldn't fight. Most of its guns were frozen or destroyed. The tail gunner was dead. The top turret was out. All they could do was fly and wait for the end. The German closed in. Brown could see the pilot now, a man with a white scarf, goggles, calm eyes. His plane sidled up to within 30 feet of the bomber's tail. In another second, he'd pull the trigger. One burst of 20mm cannon fire would finish them. All but the cannon didn't flash. The Messerschmitt drifted to the left side of the bomber instead. Close. Dangerously close. The crew watched in silence, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The Luftwaffe pilot turned his head, studying them through the shattered fuselage. He could see the dead gunner slumped in his turret. He could see the tail shredded like torn paper. He could see the holes where oxygen bottles had exploded and the faces of men too wounded to fight. Inside the B-17, Brown whispered, "Why isn't he firing?" No one answered. For nearly a minute, the two aircraft flew wing to wing through the bitter cold. The fortress groaned. The fighter glided beside it, steady as a ghost. Brown forced himself to look at the German again. For one strange heartbeat, their eyes met through glass and frost. Neither man spoke, but something passed between them, a recognition almost human. The German lifted one hand from the throttle and gestured. He pointed east, then down, telling them to land, to surrender. Brown shook his head. Even if he wanted to, the B-17 couldn't make another turn. He mouthed a single word through the glass. England. The German frowned, then nodded slowly. He slid his Messerschmitt into position just off the bomber's wingtip. Charlie Brown realized with a start that the enemy was protecting them. Below, anti-aircraft batteries waited for the kill. But seeing the two aircraft so close together, one clearly crippled, the other a Luftwaffe fighter, they held fire. The German pilot was shielding the American bomber with his own plane. The crew was silent. No one dared breathe. The engines coughed. The metal screamed. At 10,000 feet, the air warmed. The oxygen masks came off. Brown's co-pilot stirred, barely conscious. The German stayed with them, a guardian in grey and yellow. Finally, over the North Sea, he throttled back, drew level with the cockpit, and looked in one last time. Brown, shaking, raised his hand from the control column. The German returned the salute, and then he banked away, vanishing into the sun. The ye-old pub limped across the water and somehow reached the English coast. Its landing gear collapsed on touchdown, the fuselage splitting open. Ground crews counted more than 350 bullet holes. One propeller was missing entirely. The nose section had been blown apart, but against all odds, 9 men were still alive. Charlie Brown collapsed after shutting down the engines. His last clear thought before blacking out was not of victory, but of the German pilot's eyes, cold, unreadable, yet filled with something he couldn't name. When he awoke in a British infirmary, the intelligence officers were already waiting. They wanted to know, who saved you out there? Brown couldn't answer. He didn't even know if the man had been real. He would tell them, years later, that in that frozen sky above Bremen, he saw something he'd never seen in war before: mercy. And though the mission report listed the aircraft as badly damaged but returned, it could never record what had truly happened, an act so rare, so impossible, that both sides kept it secret. Because if the Luftwaffe ever discovered that one of their own had spared an enemy, that pilot would face execution. Brown looked out the window of the hospital ward. The night sky over England was calm, moonlight glinting off distant clouds. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the German was still flying. The war would go on. Thousands more would die. But that single moment, 2 enemies flying together in silence, had already rewritten everything he thought. He knew about war. You're about to witness one of the strangest acts of mercy in the entire Second World War, and this was only the beginning. High above the grey clouds of northern Germany, the engines of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 purred like a predator's breath. The man inside was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, 28 years old, a veteran of more than 400 combat missions. His plane carried the marks of 12 victories, each one carefully painted beneath the cockpit. To his comrades, he was a professional, disciplined, precise, a pilot who flew by instinct and honor. To the enemy, he was invisible death, and yet, this morning, Franz Stigler felt none of the thrill that once came with combat. He had seen too much. Since 1940, he had fought from the sands of Africa to the skies of Sicily, and now here, over a homeland slowly crumbling under Allied bombs, he had buried more friends than he could remember. He had watched boys barely 18 climb into cockpits and never return. War, he thought, was no longer about courage or glory. It was about survival, and survival was running out. The radio crackled with static. "Enemy bombers retreating west," came the voice from ground command. "Single straggler sighted near Bremen." "Finish it." Franz adjusted the throttle. His Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine roared as he climbed through the cloud bank. His gloved hand rested easily on the stick. His reflexes were automatic, his mind elsewhere. Below, the city still burned. The Focke-Wulf plant, one of the Luftwaffe's most vital factories, had been hit again. Black columns of smoke rose into the freezing air. Twisting like serpents, Franz could still see, in his memory, the faces of the ground crews running for cover as the sirens wailed. Civilians, mechanics, children in the streets clutching mothers' hands. The Americans called this strategic bombing. He called it slaughter. Still, orders were orders. He leveled off at 20,000 feet. The world above the clouds was bright and silent, a place where the earth and its misery seemed far away. He had been told to look for a damaged bomber. Easy prey, a crippled machine limping for home. He scanned the horizon and then he saw it, a silver shape glinting through the haze. 4 engines. One trailing black smoke, a B-17 flying Fortress. Franz exhaled slowly. He knew this dance by heart. The B-17 was a beast, tough, slow, built like an armored cathedral. Normally, it took a coordinated attack from several fighters to bring one down. But this one was alone. He eased the throttle forward, letting the Messerschmitt's nose drop. Through his gun sight, the enemy plane grew larger. The crosshairs hovered over the tail. One squeeze of the trigger would end it. He had been trained to see the enemy as targets, not men. His instructors had drilled it into him from the first day. But his mentor Gustav Rudel had taught something different. "Fight with honor," Rudel once said, standing on the tarmac in North Africa, dust swirling around them. "If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." At the time, Stigler had laughed, but the words had never left him. Honor. In war, it was a fragile thing, a flame barely alive in the storm. Now, as he closed in behind the wounded American bomber, that old lesson returned to him like a whisper in his headset. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown's crew struggled to stay conscious. The intercom sputtered with broken voices. Engine 2 gone. Hydraulics failing. The cockpit reeked of oil and smoke. Charlie wiped frost from the glass with the back of his glove, peering through the cracks. He could see the German plane closing fast. "Bandit at 6 o'clock, yelled the waist gunner. No one replied. There was no ammunition left. The guns were frozen. Charlie felt his stomach twist. "This is it," he muttered. Back in the Messerschmitt, Stigler adjusted his aim. The tail of the bomber was so full of holes it barely held together. One shot through the engines would finish the job. He could already picture the explosion, the black plume, the falling wreck. Another confirmed kill. A medal, perhaps, another number on the fuselage. And yet, something in the way the bomber moved caught his eye. It wasn't evading. It wasn't even turning. It was just floating. He nudged closer. The fighter's prop wash rippled across the bomber's shattered tail. Through the broken gunner's window, he saw movement. A figure slumped over the twin 50s, his head covered in blood. He frowned. He rolled his plane slightly, sliding along the right side of the bomber to see more. The nose of the B-17 was gone completely, blown open like a cracked shell. Inside, he could make out bodies. Wounded men. One was bandaging another's shoulder with strips of his own flight suit. Another sat at his gun position motionless. The pilot's face was pale and streaked with frostbite, and behind his cockpit, holes the size of fists peppered the fuselage. This wasn't a bomber anymore. It was a coffin with wings. Franz's finger tightened on the trigger, then stopped. He looked again at the men inside, and a thought flashed in his mind. Sharp as lightning. If I shoot now, it won't be combat. It will be murder. He eased back on the stick, letting the Messerschmitt rise slightly above the B-17. His engine purred. The guns stayed silent. The American pilot hadn't even noticed him yet. Through the headset, the voice of his ground controller barked again. "Stigler! Status, have you destroyed the target?" Franz didn't answer. He pulled the radio plug from its socket. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown blinked through the blood in his eyes. He glanced left and froze. There, less than 30 feet away, was the Messerschmitt. The German pilot was looking straight at him. Charlie's breath caught. He waited for the flash of cannon fire. It never came. Instead, the German raised his hand and palm open. Charlie stared, too stunned to move. For a moment, both men just looked at each other, suspended in the frozen air between death and disbelief. Franz studied the young pilot's face. Barely a man, he thought. No older than the cadets back home who'd been sent to die in the last few months. He imagined his own brother, August, who had been shot down over Tunisia the previous year. He had been 22. Franz had retrieved what was left of the wreckage himself. Pieces of uniform, part of a watch, a scorched photograph. And now here before him was another young man, just like his brother, trying to keep his dying crew alive. The thought clawed at his chest. He looked down at the firing switch again. One burst, and it would all be over. The enemy dead. The war moving on, but his hand refused to move. Instead, he pushed the throttle back, slowing to match the B-17's speed. He moved alongside the bomber, close enough to see the American's eyes through the cracked windshield. Charlie Brown's expression was a mixture of fear and confusion. Franz nodded once, slowly, and then, with a strange calm, he gestured forward, pointing toward the open sea. The American blinked, realizing what he meant. Franz kept pace, his eyes flicking between the wounded bomber and the flak batteries far below. If the ground crews opened fire now, they'd hit both aircraft, but they didn't. The sight of a German fighter flying beside a crippled American bomber was so absurd that the gunners hesitated. And in that hesitation, something miraculous was born. For the next 10 minutes, they flew together in silence. one man of war guiding another toward life. And though Franz Stigler could not have known it then, the decision he made in that instant, the moment he lifted his finger from the trigger, would follow him for the rest of his life. Because in a sky filled with fire and hatred, one thought had stopped him cold. It's not war if there's no honor left in it. The roar of engines fades into a low hum, two machines suspended in a frozen sky, one a crippled giant of silver and blood, the other a hunter forged for killing. They fly together now side by side over the dying light of December 20th, 1943. Franz Stigler adjusts his throttle. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 drifts closer to the wounded B-17 flying fortress, its shadow sliding across the bomber's shattered fuselage. The German's canopy rattles with the vibration of his engine, but inside everything feels unnaturally still. The crosshairs in his gun sight rest on the bomber's cockpit. The trigger beneath his finger feels heavier than it ever has. Just one squeeze. That's all it would take. One short burst and 4 cannons, 2 machine guns and the crippled American would fall. No witnesses. No hesitation. His orders were clear. Destroy the enemy. But as he looks through the glass, Franz sees not an enemy at all. He sees men. Inside the B-17, Lieutenant Charlie Brown can barely keep the plane level. The left wing drags, hydraulics failing. The control column trembles in his hands. Every movement feels like it might be the last. The cold has crept into their bones. Their oxygen masks hang useless now. The crew bleeds and shivers in silence. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Brown sees movement, a blur of grey, a flash of sunlight off metal. He turns his head. There, just beyond the ruined nose, the Messerschmitt floats like a ghost, no more than 30 feet away. Its pilot is looking directly at him. Brown's heart stops. His body tenses. He expects the flare of muzzle fire, the cannon shells tearing through them. But the German doesn't shoot. He's studying them. Franz leans forward in his seat, his gloved hands resting on the canopy's frame. Through the glass, he sees everything the bomber hides from the world. A gunner slumped over his weapon, blood frozen in a crimson halo, a radio operator clutching his useless arm, a co-pilot barely conscious, face grey with shock, and the pilot, a boy younger than he expected, pale and terrified, still flying the wreck through sheer will. Franz's throat tightens. He had seen plenty of death in this war, but this wasn't battle. This was slaughter. He imagines his own brother August the way he looked the day he left for North Africa, laughing, young, certain of his purpose. 2 weeks later, Franz had received the telegram. Missing in action. He had retrieved what little was left of August himself. Now, staring at the faces inside the American bomber, the memory hits him with the weight of lead. His brother could have been in that plane. Any man could have been, and what then? Would another pilot, another Franz Stigler, have spared him? He shakes the thought away, forcing focus, honor, duty, survival. He repeats them like a prayer, but the words taste hollow now. The Luftwaffe has no mercy for hesitation. He knows it. His commander, Gustav Rödel, had warned him long ago. Fight clean, Franz, but never forget that we are soldiers. We obey. Rödel was the kind of man who still believed in knights and codes and valor. But even Rödel would never forgive disobedience, and disobeying an order in Hitler's Luftwaffe meant one thing: death by firing squad. Franz glances at the trigger again. His thumb trembles, then slowly, deliberately, he lowers his hand from it. For a moment he wonders if this single act, or this refusal to kill, might end his career, his life, everything. But the thought passes, replaced by something deeper. If I kill them now, he thinks, I will have murdered honor itself. He moves closer, close enough that the bomber's fuselage fills his vision. The glass of the B-17's cockpit glows in the winter sun. Through it he can see Charlie Brown's eyes, wide, disbelieving, afraid. The German raises his hand slowly, palm open. Not a salute, not a signal. Just a gesture that says, you're seen. Charlie stares back, unable to comprehend what he's witnessing. Enemy pilots don't wave. They don't look you in the eye, but this one does. And in that moment, that brief, impossible connection, the two men understand each other perfectly. Neither speaks. The engines do the talking, a deep mechanical hymn echoing through the frozen air. Franz mouths a single word: go. He gestures toward the sea, toward home. Charlie blinks, then nods. The German nods back. They fly on, wingtip to wingtip. From below, the flak crews along the coast look up and hesitate. They can see both aircraft, the American bomber trailing smoke, and beside it a Luftwaffe fighter. But the fighter isn't attacking. Incredulous, they hold their fire. And so, for the first time that day, the skies over Germany fall silent. Franz adjusts his formation, positioning himself between the bomber and the nearest flak battery. If anyone opens fire now, the rounds will hit him first. The act is madness, treason even, but it feels right. Inside the cockpit, his heart steadies. He realizes he's breathing easier than he has in years. Maybe, he thinks, there is still something human left in this war. Minutes pass. The B-17 lurches forward, engines sputtering, trying to gain altitude. Franz can see the pilot fighting to keep control. His movement slow, his face slick with sweat and blood, and then, through the shattered glass, he sees something else. The pilot's hand trembling as it rises from the controls. Charlie Brown is saluting him. Franz freezes. Then, almost shyly, he returns the gesture. The two aircraft hold their formation for another few seconds. Two enemies bound by a silence heavier than any oath. Then Franz tilts his wings, a final signal of farewell. He banks left, peeling away from the bomber, the winter light flashing off his canopy as he disappears into the sun. In the B-17, the crew watches in stunned disbelief. "Did he just let us go?" whispers one of them. Charlie doesn't answer. He can't. His throat is too tight. He looks out the window, searching for the fighter. It's gone. All that remains is the cold air and the hum of dying engines. Far behind, Franz Stigler levels out and heads back toward Bremen. He should report his kill, claim another victory. Instead, he stays silent. When the ground controller demands confirmation, he replies only, "No sighting. Target lost in cloud cover." He cuts the transmission before anyone can question him. The Messerschmitt descends through the haze, its engine whining softly. Franz stares straight ahead, his face unreadable. Inside, though, his mind is burning. He has defied an order, risked his life for strangers, for enemies, and yet, for the first time in years, he feels clean. He imagines those men limping across the North Sea, the wounded breathing, the engines holding long, enough to touch English soil. He imagines their faces when they realize they're alive, that the enemy who could have killed them chose not to. He closes his eyes for a moment and exhales, his hand lowered from the trigger. And that defiance could have cost him his life. But for Franz Stigler, it had already saved something far greater. It had saved his soul. The world below them is a frozen graveyard of smoke and ruin. The sky, pale, colorless, hangs between war and silence. At 20,000 feet, two aircraft cut through the winter air like wounded birds. One, a battered B-17 Flying Fortress, its wings shredded, its engines coughing flame. The other, a sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109, flying so close that its wingtip nearly grazes the American's tail. For a moment, time itself seems to stop. No gunfire, no flak, just the sound of engines, one sputtering, the other steady. Franz Stigler watches the bomber beside him. The fortress trembles with every gust of wind, its metal groaning under the weight of gravity and death. Through its shattered windows, he can still see faces. A man tending to another's wound, a head rising weakly from the cockpit. The faint movement of life. They should have been his enemies. And yet, something inside him refuses to see them that way anymore. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown grips the control column with trembling hands. The instruments are half dead. Frost clings to the glass. His voice is hoarse, his body numb. He glances to his left and sees the impossible. The German fighter still there, flying in formation. The crew watches too. The navigator whispers, "Why isn't he shooting?" Brown doesn't answer. He can't. He knows exactly what the man beside him could do. One squeeze of the trigger, and their story would end in fire. But instead, the German flies beside them, eyes fixed forward, wings steady, as if guarding them. Franz can see the coastline ahead, faint and ghostly through the haze, the edge of Germany, and beyond it, the North Sea. The flak batteries on the ground are already tracking the pair, but the gunners hesitate. They see a Luftwaffe fighter flying so close to an American bomber that the two shapes almost blend. They can't fire. Franz knows it. and he's using it. He positions his Messerschmitt slightly below and to the left of the B-17, shielding it from the guns below. If anyone fires now, the shells will hit him first. He risks a glance upward. The bomber's underside glows in the sun, torn, blackened, but still alive. He feels a strange calm. For the first time in years, his mission is not destruction. It's protection. Inside the fortress, the radio operator wipes frost from his cracked window. "Skipper." "He's flying escort," he mutters. "Like he's watching over us." No one believes it. The waist gunner, his hands shaking, whispers, "Maybe he's toying with us. Maybe he's calling more fighters." But Brown shakes his head. "No," he says quietly. "He could have killed us 10 times already." The crew falls silent. They can see the Messerschmitt's pilot now in the sunlight catching his goggles, the faint white of a scarf around his neck. And then, impossibly, he looks back. Their eyes meet again through glass and frost across an ocean of war. For a second, the line between enemies disappears. Franz adjusts his altitude, keeping the bomber in sight. The coastline approaches and the edge of home. Beyond that line is open sea. If they can reach it, they'll be safe from the German guns. He thinks of his commander's warning. "If I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself. Honor, always honor, but what about mercy? What about risking everything for it?" He knows the rules. The Luftwaffe's code of conduct is absolute. Helping an enemy means treason, court-martial, execution by firing squad. He should turn away now, leave the bomber to its fate, but he can't. He can't leave these men behind. Franz clenches the stick and holds formation. "Come on," he mutters under his breath. "You can make it." The two planes cross the final line of German territory. Below them, the land gives way to endless grey water. The flak ceases. The guns fall silent. The sky opens into freedom. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown exhales a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hands shake as he keeps the bomber level. He looks again at the German beside him. "He's still with us," he says softly. The radio operator murmurs, "Why?" Charlie stares at the Messerschmitt for a long time before answering. Maybe he's got his own war to fight. Franz looks down at the waves, then back at the crippled fortress. They've made it. The bomber is clear. His fuel is low. His orders are broken. His life, if anyone finds out, is over. But in his heart, something stirs. Something he hasn't felt since the war began. Pride. Not the pride of victory or medals or propaganda. The pride of having done something right. He moves closer. One last time. The two planes are flying so near that Charlie can see the chipped paint on the Messerschmitt's nose, the faint smudge of soot from battle. Franz glances toward the cockpit and raises his hand in salute, a crisp, deliberate gesture. Charlie blinks, stunned, then slowly, he raises his own hand and salutes back. For a heartbeat, the air between them feels sacred. No bombs, no borders, no war. Just two men, two soldiers who are to understand. Franz dips his wings, the universal sign of farewell. Then, with a final glance, he banks left and pulls away. The Messerschmitt gliding into the sun. The bomber's crew watches in silence. No one speaks until the fighter has vanished completely. Only then does the radio operator whisper, "He let us go." Charlie's voice cracks. He risked court-martial and execution for what he did next. In the distance, the B-17 limps toward England. Its shadow stretches long and broken across the sea. A ghost over the waves. Franz circles once, making sure no other fighters are near, then turns back toward Germany. As he flies, he replays the last 10 minutes in his mind. The faces, the damage, the decision. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't pity. It was something older than war, something born of honor. By the time he lands at his airfield near Bremen, the sun is setting. The air smells of oil and smoke. He parks the Messerschmitt and climbs down, boots crunching on frost. His ground crew rushes up to ask about the mission, but he says nothing. "Target?" they ask. He shakes his head. "No sighting." Nothing left to report. He walks away before they can ask more. In his quarters that night, he sits at his small desk, staring at a framed photograph. His brother, August, smiling in his flight jacket, he whispers, "I hope someone would have done the same for you." Outside, the airfield lights flicker in the dark. Inside, Franz Stigler closes his eyes. He knows tomorrow he'll fight again. He'll face more bombers, more death. But tonight, at least, he remembers what it means to be human. And somewhere far to the west, a dying B-17 limps across the North Sea, its engines coughing smoke and faith. Inside, 9 men breathe, alive because one enemy had refused to stop seeing them as men. The sky is clear now. The sun fades into cloud. 2 aircraft, once bound by hate part ways, forever changed. And in that silence, the war, just for a moment, forgot itself. The B-17 limped across the grey expanse of the North Sea, its 4 engines coughing and wheezing like dying lungs. Inside, silence hung heavier than the cold. No one dared speak. Every man on board knew they were living on borrowed time. The control column shuddered in Charlie Brown's hands as the last of the fuel sputtered through the lines. The fortress creaked with every gust of wind. Holes riddled the fuselage. Half the control surfaces were gone. Yet somehow, impossibly, they were still in the air. Through the haze, a coastline appeared. England. Brown's voice cracked through the intercom. "Brace for landing. We're going home. RAF Seething Airfield, Norfolk, December 20th, 1943. The control tower spotted the silhouette first, a bomber that looked less like a plane and more like a ghost. The tower officer squinted, muttering, "Dear God, what's holding that thing together?" As the crippled B-17F Ye Old Pub descended, the airfield crews ran to the perimeter. Its landing gear barely held. Smoke trailed from 2 engines. One wingtip hung at a crooked angle. Charlie kept her steady, whispering to the plane as if it were a wounded animal. "Just a few more seconds, old girl. Just a few more." The fortress hit the runway, skidding, metal screaming against tarmac. Sparks flew. The nose dipped, then lurched up again before finally groaning to a stop. The medic sprinted forward. The air smelled of oil, frost, and blood. Inside, 9 men sat in stunned silence, bruised, burned, bleeding. One by one, they looked around and realized the impossible. They were alive. Later, in the debriefing room, Brown sat before a table of stunned officers. His flight suit was torn, face streaked with dried blood. The intelligence major tapped his pencil on the report. "You're saying a German fighter escorted you out? Protected you?" "Yes, sir," Charlie said quietly. "He could have finished us, but he didn't." The room went still. Someone laughed nervously. "You sure you weren't seeing things, Lieutenant?" "You lost a lot of blood. I know what I saw," Brown said. He looked me right in the eyes. The major leaned forward. "Did you get his markings?" Brown hesitated. "Part of a yellow nose. Possibly JG-27 North Africa colors." The major frowned. "JG-27? They were transferred months ago." "Then he must have come home," Brown said. "So he saluted me." No one replied. Finally, the major closed his notebook. "Lieutenant Brown, you will not speak of this incident again. Not to your crew, not to anyone. Understand, sir? You're not to tell the press or another unit. The idea of a Luftwaffe pilot showing mercy undermines morale. The men need to believe the enemy is ruthless." Charlie swallowed. "Yes, sir. Good, get some rest. And for God's sake, don't talk." Outside the door, his crew waited, bandaged, exhausted, eyes hollow. Brown nodded once, the silent order understood. The truth would stay between them. They never spoke of it again. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, Franz Stigler taxied his Messerschmitt into the hangar at Bremen. The evening light was thin, the air freezing. Mechanics rushed toward him, expecting a report of another victory. He climbed out of the cockpit slowly. His face was blank. "Target destroyed, Herr Oberleutnant?" asked a young crewman. Stigler paused, then said evenly, "Nein, I lost him in the cloud cover." The boy frowned. "But sir, command said—" "Write it as I said it," Franz interrupted. Nothing more. He walked away before anyone could question him. Inside his quarters, he closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The truth burned inside his chest. Under Nazi military law, aiding the enemy was treason. Treason meant execution. No trial, no appeal. If the incident ever came to light, the Gestapo wouldn't hesitate. He poured himself a drink. His hands trembled. In his logbook, he wrote a single line. No contact. No victory. And then beneath it, a word he hadn't used in years. Ehre, honor. The war dragged on. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was dying, starved of fuel, pilots, and hope. Stigler flew until the end, watching his comrades fall one by one. He saw Germany crumble, saw the swastika torn down, saw cities turn to ash. When the war finally ended, He found himself in a shattered country. No air force, no homeland, no brotherhood left. To survive, he became a refugee, then a truck driver, then a farmer. He emigrated to Canada, carrying only a few belongings and a heart full of ghosts. Charlie Brown returned to the United States after the war. He married, had children, and joined the Air Force Reserve. On the surface, he was a decorated pilot, survivor of 30 bombing missions, but deep down, something about that day over Bremen never left him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the German's face, calm, unreadable, and the raised hand that had spared his life. Who was he? Did he live through the war? Did he regret letting them go? Charlie never knew, and for decades he couldn't tell anyone, not even his wife. It was too unbelievable, too fragile to explain. In 1959, Franz Stigler bought a small house in Vancouver. He rarely spoke of the war. To his neighbors, he was just another quiet immigrant with haunted eyes. But sometimes, on clear evenings, he would step outside and look up at the contrails crossing the sunset sky. He'd watch the planes disappear into the clouds, their wings glowing white, and wonder if one of them carried a man who remembered him. And then he'd turn away, whispering a prayer he'd learned from his brother. May we all land safely. Years became decades. The war stories faded, replaced by new ones. The world changed. Jet engines, satellites, moon landings. But in two different countries, two old pilots carried the same secret. A story they couldn't tell. A memory they couldn't bury. Every Christmas, Charlie would sit by the window, staring at the sky, thinking of that day. His daughter once asked, "Dad, why do you always look east this time of year?" He smiled faintly. Because someone out there once looked back. Both men aged. Both thought the other was long dead. Franz believed the bomber must have crashed before reaching England. Charlie assumed the German fighter had been killed before the war ended. The silence between them stretched over 40 years, 4 decades of unanswered questions and quiet gratitude. But history has a strange way of circling back. In 1988, retired Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Brown sat in his study in Florida, going through old mission reports for a veterans reunion. He paused at one entry, Bremen, December 20th, 1943. He stared at the words for a long time, then whispered, "I wonder if he's still out there." That night, he wrote a short letter to a Luftwaffe veterans newsletter in Germany, looking for a pilot who spared my B-17 over Bremen in 1943. He escorted us to the coast instead of finishing us. He saluted before flying away. "Please contact if you know anything." He didn't expect an answer, but thousands of miles away in a small home near Vancouver, an old man opened his mail one morning and froze. The letter described every detail exactly as he remembered. Franz Stigler lowered the page slowly. His eyes filling with tears, he whispered, "My God, he's alive." They would not speak for 40 years until fate intervened. What came next would reunite two men who had once met in the sky between life and death, and prove that even in war, mercy can echo across a lifetime. By the late 1980s, the world had moved on. The jet age had replaced propellers. Germany was whole again, and the war that once set the sky on fire had faded into the quiet of history books and black and white documentaries. But in a quiet house in Miami, Florida, one man still carried a memory brighter than any flame. Charlie Brown, retired lieutenant colonel, 70 years old, sat in his study surrounded by old logbooks, photos, and letters. Outside, palm trees swayed in the humid evening air, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely, above Bremen, December 1943, where death had come for him in the form of a grey Messerschmitt that didn't pull the trigger. He'd spent 4 decades trying to forget that face. Now, in the stillness of retirement, he realized he didn't want to forget anymore. He wanted to find him. The search began the way most lost causes do, with a question and an envelope. Charlie had kept his original mission report, the one he'd filed back in England after crash landing the B-17. The words "enemy fighter showed mercy" had been crossed out in red ink by a superior officer, replaced with "classified, omit from record." He stared at it now, the ink faded to brown. "It happened," he muttered to himself, "and I need to know why." He started writing letters to war museums, to historians, to Luftwaffe veterans groups in Germany. Most went unanswered. A few came back with polite replies. Impossible to determine. No record of such incident, or the pilot likely perished. But Charlie kept going. Every night after dinner, he'd sit at his desk with a cup of coffee and comb through lists of German fighter units that had been stationed near Bremen in December 1943, JG-27. JG-54, JG-1, names that once terrified bomber crews now read like ghosts in his hands. He mailed dozens of letters across the Atlantic, unsure if any would ever reach the right eyes. Then one day, while reading a veteran's newsletter called Combat Pilot, Charlie saw a small section on the back page titled International Contacts. He paused. The editor mentioned a new German publication, Breakthrough, a newsletter connecting former Luftwaffe pilots around the world. Charlie leaned forward, eyes bright for the first time in years. "That's it," he whispered. "That's where he'll be." In January 1988, he sat down at his desk and began to type. His hands trembled slightly as the old typewriter clacked, "Looking for the Luftwaffe pilot who spared my B-17 on December 20th, 1943, near Bremen. We were a crew of 10 aboard ye old pub, badly damaged after a mission. You did not fire. You escorted us to the sea and saluted before departing. I never forgot. Charlie Brown, Miami, Florida, USA." He mailed it to Germany and waited. Weeks passed. Then months. No answer. He almost gave up. Thousands of miles away on the western coast of Canada, a retired businessman named Franz Stigler sat on his porch overlooking the harbor in Vancouver. He was 72. His hair was white now, but his eyes, sharp blue, steady, hadn't changed. He spent most mornings tinkering with model airplanes or watching commercial jets roar overhead, their engines screaming like ghosts of his past. He'd long since made peace with what he'd done that day in 1943. He never spoke of it, never sought recognition. He didn't need to. The world had moved on, and so had he, or at least that's what he told himself, until one morning when the mail arrived. His wife, Agnes, handed him a small envelope from Germany. "It looks like one of your old aviation clubs," she said. Franz opened it casually. Inside was the latest issue of Breakthrough. He flipped through the pages, smiling at old photos, Messerschmitts lined up on runways, veterans posing at reunions, stories of battles long over. Then on page 3, a headline caught his eye. "Seeking the German pilot who spared a B-17 over Bremen, December 1943. Franz froze. He read it again. Slowly this time, then again. The words hit him like a punch. Spared a B-17, escorted to the sea, saluted before departing. He couldn't move. His hands began to tremble. Agnes noticed. "Franz, are you all right?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at the letter. Finally, he whispered, "It's him." He stood up, pacing the room. His heart pounded like the first time he'd taken off in a fighter. 45 years had passed. He'd convinced himself those men hadn't survived, but this letter, this message from across the ocean, was proof. They'd made it, and now, one of them was looking for him. That night, he barely slept. Memories flooded back. The crippled bomber, the young pilot's terrified eyes, the salute through shattered glass. He remembered lowering his hand from the trigger. He remembered the silence that followed, the most profound silence he had ever heard. And now, that silence had been broken by a letter in a veteran's magazine. He looked up the address listed in the publication, Miami, Florida. Then he picked up the phone. His hand hovered over the dial. Back in Florida, Charlie was sitting in his study, rereading the same newsletters he'd sent out. When the phone rang, he almost didn't answer. It was late, close to midnight, but something made him pick it up. "Hello?" The voice on the other end carried a faint German accent. "Is this Mr. Brown?" "The pilot of the B-17 over Bremen." Charlie's breath caught in his throat. Yes, it is." "Who is this?" The line went quiet for a moment. Then the man said softly, "My name is Franz Stigler. I was the one who did not shoot you down." Silence. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Both were overcome by the weight of 4.5 decades collapsing into a single phone call. Then Charlie laughed, not out of humor, but relief. "My God," he whispered. "You're real," Franz chuckled. "I could say the same to you, my friend." They spoke for nearly an hour that night. Two old men talking across continents. their voices trembling with age and disbelief. Franz told him how he'd followed the B-17 to the coast, how he'd lied to his commander, how he'd carried the secret his whole life. Charlie shared how his crew had been sworn to silence, how he'd searched for years without success. When the call ended, both men sat in stunned quiet, hearts full. Eyes wet, minds spinning. After 45 years, the sky between them was no longer divided by war. The next morning, Charlie wrote in his journal, "He was everything I remembered, calm, kind, human. The man who spared me still lives, and now I will meet him." He booked a flight to Vancouver, promising to make the trip within weeks. For Franz, the wait was unbearable. He polished the framed photo of his old unit, pressed his uniform jacket and told his wife, "The American pilot, he's coming." Agnes smiled softly. "After all this time?" Franz nodded. "After all this time. Two men, once enemies, now brothers bound by a single act of mercy, were about to meet face to face, and when they did, the world would finally learn what happens when honor survives the war." The Florida air was heavy with sunlight and salt, the kind that clings to skin and memory alike. At Miami International Airport, an elderly man stood in the arrivals hall, his hands trembling though he wasn't cold. Charlie Brown, now in his 70s, adjusted his tie and looked toward the terminal gate. Around him, travelers came and went, their lives quick and unremarkable, unaware that history was about to walk through a sliding glass door. 45 years. 45 years since that day above Bremen. He had spent nearly half a century wondering if he'd imagined it all. Now he was about to see the proof that he hadn't. The announcement came over the loudspeaker. Flight 308 arriving from Vancouver. Charlie's heart stuttered. Then through the crowd he saw him, Franz Stigler, tall, thin, white-haired, moving slowly but with unmistakable poise. His blue eyes were sharp even now, as if still scanning the horizon. For a moment neither man spoke. They simply stood there, frozen in time. Two pilots bound by a memory that refused to die. Then, without a word, Charlie stepped forward. Franz did the same. Their hands met halfway, a single handshake that carried the weight of the sky itself. "Franz," Charlie said, voice trembling. "I owe you my life." The old German smiled, his eyes soft. "No, Charlie, you owe me nothing." Charlie shook his head. "You could have pulled the trigger. My whole crew and we were finished." "But you didn't." "I could not," Franz replied. His English was accented but clear. "You were defenseless. To kill you then would not be war. It would be murder." Silence hung between them, not awkward but sacred. Charlie nodded slowly. "When I saw you that day, I thought, and this is it. This is the end. But instead you gave me my life. You gave me my crew. You gave me hope." Franz's gaze dropped for a moment. "I gave you what every man should give another. Even in war, respect." They sat together for hours that afternoon, talking like old comrades reunited after a long separation. Charlie brought out photos, the crew of ye old pub smiling after the war, grey-haired and alive because of one man's decision. Franz smiled as he looked through them. "So they all made it home?" "Every one of them," Charlie said. "They never forgot that German pilot who let them live." Franz chuckled softly. "Then I am happy." Charlie leaned back. "You know, Franz, when I first started flying again after the war, I couldn't stop thinking about you, about what you did. I told myself if I ever met you, I'd ask why." Franz looked out the window, sunlight catching the side of his face. "Because my commander taught me something long ago," he said. "He told me, if I ever hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You fight to protect, not to kill needlessly." He turned back to Charlie, voice quiet. "That day you were a man in a parachute. That is all I saw." Charlie exhaled. "You risked everything for that. The Gestapo would have executed you if they'd found out." Franz nodded. "Perhaps. But better to die for honor than live without it." Later they went outside, walking slowly toward the parking lot. The Florida sky was clear, streaked with contrails that gleamed like silver scars. Franz shaded his eyes and looked up. "The sky still remembers," he murmured. Charlie smiled faintly. "Yes, and maybe it forgives too." They stood in silence for a while, watching the planes ascend into the blue. Over the next few years, they became inseparable. Phone calls every week, letters, visits. They told their story together at veterans' reunions, in classrooms, at air shows, not to boast, but to remind others that even in war there is room for mercy. At one event, a young cadet asked, "Mr. Stigler, why did you spare your enemy?" Franz looked at the boy and smiled gently. "He was never my enemy." "Just another young man caught in the storm," Charlie added. "We were all soldiers doing what we were told. But that day one man remembered something greater than orders." Franz nodded. "I remembered what it meant to be human." By 1993, time was catching up with them. Both men were in their 80s, their bodies frail but their friendship unbreakable. When they spoke now, it was less about the war and more about what it had taught them. One evening, sitting together in Franz's living room in Vancouver, Charlie raised a glass. "To the day we met," he said. Franz smiled. "To the day we did not die." They laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes only after everything else has been said. When Franz passed away later that year, Charlie flew to Vancouver for the funeral. He stood by the casket in silence, his hand resting on the wood. When it was his turn to speak, his voice broke only once. "Franz Stigler showed me that humanity is not defined by the flag we serve, but by the mercy we show. He was my enemy by war, my brother by choice." He paused, looking up at the mourners. "And if heaven has a hangar, I like to think he's already there, checking his plane, waiting for one more flight." After the service, Charlie walked outside and looked toward the horizon. A jet passed overhead, glinting in the sun. He whispered, "Safe travels, Franz." And somewhere perhaps the sky whispered back, years later. When people asked Charlie Brown what that moment in 1943 had meant to him, he would always smile and say the same thing. "It reminded me that even in the darkest skies, mercy can fly. We often remember war for the cruelty it breeds, the destruction, the hate, the loss. But sometimes what endures are the moments that defy it. Moments like one man refusing to pull the trigger. Moments like a handshake 45 years later. In the end, that is what the sky remembers. Not who won, but who stayed human." If this story moved you, share it. Tell it to someone who's forgotten what compassion looks like. Because mercy, once given, never dies. It just waits for the next soul brave enough to pass it on. Even in the darkest skies, mercy can fly.